The coffee had gone cold over an hour ago, but Grace Mitchell still kept her thin fingers wrapped around the paper cup as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The cafe in Coral Gables hummed with afternoon energy, the kind of place where people came to be seen rather than to actually drink overpriced lattes. And she did not belong here. She sat hunched over her battered laptop in the corner booth, her chestnut hair falling limply around a face that had grown too thin, translating medical documents for a pharmaceutical company that paid barely enough to cover the rent she was already 2 weeks behind on. Her back ached from the weight she carried now, 5 months of it pressing against her spine no matter how she shifted on the uncomfortable wooden chair, and the secondhand maternity jeans she had bought from a thrift store dug painfully into her sides. She had stopped trying to hide the swell of her stomach under oversized sweaters because there was no hiding it anymore, just like there was no hiding the faint scars on her wrist that peeked out from her sleeve when she reached for her cold coffee. The document on her screen blurred as she rubbed her green eyes with exhaustion. Medical terminology in 3 languages, due by midnight, and she was only halfway through. Her phone lay face down beside the laptop. 7 missed calls from a divorce attorney she could not afford to call back because every conversation cost another $100 she did not have. Her wallet held exactly $23. Her refrigerator held nothing, and her stomach had been empty since yesterday because the baby needed whatever little she could scrape together more than she did. Grace pressed one hand to her belly, feeling the small life flutter against her palm, and whispered an apology to the child she was not sure she could provide for. Then a voice cut through the cafe noise like a blade, freezing the blood in her veins. Grace. She would have recognized that voice in her sleep, in her nightmares, in the darkest corners of her memory, where she had tried to bury 7 years of hell. She looked up slowly, dreading what she would see. Tyler Brooks stood 3 feet from her table, his sandy hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes scanning her with an expression that started as surprise and curdled into something uglier, something she knew too well. He wore a suit that probably cost more than her car, charcoal fabric stretched across shoulders he had always been proud of, and the woman beside him was everything Grace was not anymore. Megan Clark was thin, polished, wearing a red dress that clung to her body like a second skin, her manicured hand sliding possessively around Tyler's arm as she looked Grace up and down with the silent calculation women give each other in bathrooms and parking lots. Grace apparently did not register as a threat, just a cautionary tale of what happened to women who let themselves go. Wow, Tyler's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile on anyone else. I almost did not recognize you. And in that moment, sitting in that expensive cafe with her cold coffee and her empty wallet and her baby kicking against her ribs, Grace Mitchell felt the walls closing in around her, trapping her in the nightmare she thought she had finally escaped. If this story satisfies your soul, hit the like button to let the algorithm know. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And subscribe so you will not miss what happens when the devil himself decides to save her. Now, let's get back to our story today. Grace wanted to say something, anything to defend herself, but her throat locked up as if someone were squeezing it tight. Tyler stepped closer, his blue eyes sweeping from her face down to her swelling belly, then stopping there with undisguised disgust. He let out a soft whistle, a sound she had heard hundreds of times over 7 years of marriage, the sound that always meant something cruel was coming. "You've really let yourself go, haven't you?" Tyler said loudly enough for the people at the next table to hear. "I know divorce is hard, but stuffing yourself isn't exactly the solution, Grace." Megan giggled, her laughter light like wind chimes in a breeze, and Grace felt the blood rush hot into her face. She wasn't fat from overeating. She was pregnant. But the explanations lodged in her throat like sharp stones. Tyler tilted his head, putting on that fake concern she knew far too well, the same tone he'd used for years to make her feel stupid and worthless. "Remember," Tyler went on, "you used to be so beautiful, so careful with your body. You never ate carbs after 6 in the evening, and you went to the gym 5 days a week. I was so proud of you. And now look at you." He gestured at her as if she were a museum exhibit of failure. Grace tried to stand. Her laptop bag was on the seat, and she needed to get out of here immediately, before she cried in front of him, in front of Megan, in front of the entire cafe that was starting to turn and stare. But Tyler didn't move. His body completely blocked the exit of the booth, and with a cold wave of horror, Grace realized he was doing this on purpose, trapping her the way he used to in the house she had called hell for 7 years. "Excuse me," Grace said, her voice shaking despite her effort to control it. "I need to leave." Tyler didn't budge. "Leave where?" he asked with a smirk. "Back to that filthy apartment you're renting, or to that low-paying job of yours. I hear you're doing translation work now." "Really, Grace? With your master's degree, that's all you can manage?" Megan looked at Grace with the same expression Grace had seen on bullies back in high school. the look of someone who knew she had the upper hand and was savoring every second. "Maybe she's happy now," Megan said in a syrupy, sweet voice. "Some people find comfort in food." Tyler laughed, the sound sharp like shattered glass. "Happy," he repeated. "Look at her stomach, Megan. She looks pregnant. Must be some guy she picked up after the divorce, because it sure isn't mine." I always made sure not to leave mistakes behind. The words stabbed into Grace like knives, and she felt the baby kick violently inside her, as if it sensed its mother's pain. She remembered the night she told Tyler she wanted a child, and how he'd laughed in her face, saying he'd never want a baby with a woman like her. She remembered the nights he came home late with another woman's perfume on his clothes, and when she asked, he shoved her against the wall and said if she were a better wife, he wouldn't have had to look elsewhere. She remembered the bruises on her ribs, the cut on her lip, the times she told coworkers she'd fallen down the stairs. "You should be thanking me," Tyler said, dragging her back to the present. "I freed you from that marriage so you could become this." He pointed at her again. An overweight single mother with no future. Tears welled up, and Grace bit her lip until she tasted blood to hold them back. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. But inside, she was breaking apart piece by piece, and she wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Take her anywhere that wasn't here. Wasn't this moment? Wasn't under the judgmental gaze of Tyler Brooks and his young, beautiful lover. The cafe fell into an eerie silence, as if everyone were holding their breath, and Grace Mitchell had never felt so alone and so humiliated in all 27 years of her life. "She asked you to step aside." The voice cut through the cafe's silence like a blade through butter, low and cold, carrying a distinct Italian cadence Grace couldn't mistake. Tyler spun around, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Grace saw the confidence on her ex-husband's face falter. The man standing behind Tyler was nearly a head taller, probably around 6'1", with ink-black hair and eyes of the same color, so deep they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A thin scar ran through his left eyebrow, and the black suit he wore fit his body as if it had been tailored for every curve of muscle beneath the fabric. He stood perfectly still, no wasted movement, no expression on his sculpted face. Yet there was something in that stillness that made the entire cafe seem to freeze. Grace knew instantly this wasn't an ordinary man. This was the kind of man who, when he entered a room, made everything else feel smaller and irrelevant. "I don't know who you are," Tyler said, trying to recover his composure, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. "This is a private matter between me and my ex-wife." The man didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Tyler with the gaze Grace had seen in leopards at the zoo as they watched prey through glass, patient, calculating, and utterly certain of the outcome. "Ex-wife," the man repeated, as if the word itself carried a foul smell. "Which means it's no longer your business." Tyler took a step forward, his chin lifting with the reflex of someone used to bullying others, but he stopped short when two figures appeared at either side of the dark-haired man. They wore identical dark suits, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, standing with the posture of men trained to use violence efficiently. Grace realized they were bodyguards, and that realization told her the man protecting her was no ordinary businessman. Tyler realized it too, and for the first time Grace saw real fear flicker in her ex-husband's blue eyes. Megan tugged at Tyler's arm, her red polished nails scraping against his jacket sleeve. "Tyler, I think we should go," she said, her voice stripped of its earlier smugness. Tyler stood still for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The battle between ego and survival instinct playing clearly across his face. Then he took a step back. "I don't know who you're involved with," Tyler said to Grace, though his voice was aimed more at the dark-haired man. "But you should be careful. Men like this don't help anyone for free. They always want something. And looking at you now, I don't think you have anything left to give." "Leave," the dark-haired man said, and it wasn't a suggestion. Tyler opened his mouth as if to add something, but one of the bodyguards stepped forward, just a single step, and that was enough to make Tyler turn and drag Megan toward the door. Grace watched her ex-husband's back disappear through the glass entrance, and she didn't know whether she should feel more relieved or more afraid, because the man who had just saved her might be 100 times more dangerous than Tyler Brooks. The man signaled to the two bodyguards, and they stepped back a few paces, far enough to allow privacy, close enough to intervene if necessary. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been with Tyler, though it retained its deep resonant quality. Grace opened her mouth, intending to say she was fine, intending to thank him and gather her things and leave like a normal, composed adult, but instead she found herself nodding as tears spilled over without warning. She hated herself for it, hated that she was crying in front of a complete stranger, but everything Tyler had just said was spinning inside her head and she couldn't stop it. The man didn't speak. He showed no irritation, no impatience. He simply stood there and waited until she managed to regain a little control. Grace drew a deep breath, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and tried to stand to collect her laptop. She stood too quickly, and the room began to spin, black spots dancing in her vision as her knees buckled. She didn't fall, because a firm hand caught her by the elbow, holding her steady until the dizziness passed. "Sit down," the man said, and it was an order, not a suggestion. Grace sat, not because she wanted to obey, but because her legs truly couldn't support her. The man took the seat across from her, his movements economical and precise, as if each one had been calculated in advance. He lifted a hand to signal the server, and a young woman hurried over as if she'd been waiting for his cue. A glass of fresh orange juice, a plate of toast with butter, a bowl of chicken soup, and whatever has the most protein on your menu, he said without glancing at it. The server nodded and vanished. "I don't need that." Grace began to protest, but the man looked at her in a way that made the words die in her throat. "You haven't eaten since yesterday," he said, not as a question but a statement, "and you're pregnant. Eat." It wasn't a request. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to say she didn't need anyone's pity. But the smell of food when the plate of toast was set in front of her made her stomach cry out. She picked up a piece of bread and took a bite, then another, and before she realized it, the plate was empty. The man said nothing, only nudged the bowl of soup toward her, and Grace kept eating as if she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks, which in truth she hadn't. When she finally looked up, her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment, but the man showed no judgment. He was studying her worn laptop, the screen still displaying the medical document she'd been translating. "A translator," he said. "Yes," Grace replied, unsure why she was answering a stranger. "3 languages," he continued, looking at the screen. "English, Spanish, and it appears Portuguese." Grace nodded. "How much are they paying you for this work?" he asked. The bluntness of the question made Grace blink. "Enough to live," she said, and it was a lie they both knew. The man studied her for a long moment, as if he were reading every page of her life through her eyes. "I have a job for you," he said. "My company needs a multilingual translator. The salary is 5 times what you're earning now, full health insurance, and working conditions far better than sitting in a cafe with cold coffee." Grace stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "Why?" she asked, suspicion thick in her voice. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know if I'm good at my job. You don't know who I am." "I know enough," the man replied. "You need work. I need a translator. It's that simple." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a black business card with silver lettering on the table in front of her. "Alessandro Rossi," she read. No title, no company name, just the name and a phone number. "Think about it," Alessandro said as he stood. "But don't think too long. Opportunities don't wait forever." Then he turned and walked out of the cafe, the 2 bodyguards following silently behind him, leaving Grace alone with the card in her hand and millions of questions crowding her mind. Grace's studio apartment sat on the 4th floor of a decaying building in the roughest part of Miami, a place where the stairwell reeked of urine and the hallway lights flickered like they were on their last breath. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space so cramped that the narrow bed nearly touched the kitchenette, then lowered herself onto the only plastic chair in front of a makeshift desk cobbled together from 2 wooden crates and a plank. The black business card burned in her pocket like a live thing. Grace pulled it out, set it on the desk, and stared at the name printed in elegant silver letters. Alessandro Rossi. She opened her old laptop, waited nearly 3 minutes for it to finish booting, then typed the name into Google's search bar. What appeared on the screen made her blood run cold. Alessandro Rossi, head of the Rossi family, one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates on the east coast of the United States. Headlines seemed to dance before her eyes. FBI continues surveillance of the Rossi empire. Witness in Rossi case disappears mysteriously. Alessandro Rossi acquitted in murder trial due to lack of evidence. Grace scrolled down, her heart pounding violently in her chest, and kept reading. An investigative magazine article detailed the people who had dared to stand up against the Rossi family. The list was terrifyingly long, and what they all shared was that none of them were still alive to tell the story. Some had been found floating in rivers, some had vanished without a trace, some had died in suspicious car accidents. She saw a photograph of Alessandro taken by a paparazzo outside a courthouse, his face cold as ice, his black eyes utterly devoid of emotion, and she realized it was exactly the man who had sat across from her in the cafe, the man who had ordered food for her and offered her a dream salary. Grace shoved the laptop away as if it had burst into flames. She had almost agreed to work for the Mafia. She had almost dragged herself and her unborn child into a world of murder and drugs and violence. She looked down at her 5-month belly, placed a hand over it, and felt the baby kick gently, as if it were worried too. No, Grace whispered to herself. It can't be. No matter how desperate she was, she couldn't bring her child into that world. She thought of what Tyler had said in the cafe, that men like that don't help anyone for free, that they always want something. And for the first time in her life, she hated having to admit that her ex-husband was right. Alessandro Rossi wasn't a dark knight, riding in to save her from a dragon. He was the dragon, and she would be a fool to step willingly into its lair. Grace picked up the business card, looked at it one last time, then tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the silent room like a declaration. She tore it again into 4 pieces, then 8, and dropped them all into the trash beside the desk. That's it, she told herself. The decision was made. She would find another way. She would take on extra work. She would ask for an advance. She would do anything except sell her soul to the devil. Grace lay back on the bed, the old mattress creaking beneath her weight, and stared up at the ceiling, its cracks spreading like the map of a ruined land. She placed both hands over her belly, felt the baby move inside her, and whispered into the darkness. "We'll find another way, my love," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I promise you, I'll find another way." But deep down, Grace Mitchell didn't know what that other way was, and fear of the future began to gnaw at her from the inside like a starving beast. The pounding on the door came at 10 at night, violent and impatient, yanking Grace out of her restless half-sleep. She staggered to the door, her heavy belly slowing every step, and when she opened it, the landlady stood there with a face carved from stone. Mrs. Rodriguez was a woman in her 60s, with eyes that had never learned how to soften, and tonight she was holding a large black trash bag. "Out," she said without the slightest courtesy. "You're 2 weeks late on rent and I don't run a charity." Grace felt the ground give way beneath her feet. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Give me a few more days. I'll have the money. I'm working on a big project and—" Mrs. Rodriguez raised a hand to cut her off. "I heard that promise last week," she said, "and the week before that. I don't care if you're pregnant or dying. This is business, not mercy. You have 30 minutes to pack your things and get out." Grace wanted to drop to her knees and beg, wanted to cry and explain her situation, but she looked into Mrs. Rodriguez's cold eyes and knew no words would move this woman. She turned back inside, shoved clothes into her old backpack, hugged her laptop to her chest, and walked out of the apartment she had called home for 6 months. The door slammed shut behind her, the click of the lock sounding like a coffin sealing closed. Grace stood in the dark hallway, the stench of urine burning her nose, with no idea where to go. She had no family. Her mother had died when she was 8. Her father had left long before that. The aunt who had raised her through years of hell had died of cirrhosis 3 years earlier. She had no friends. Tyler had isolated her from everyone during 7 years of marriage, and old acquaintances had forgotten she existed long ago. Grace stepped out onto the streets of Miami, the humid night air clinging to her skin like a thin film, and began to walk with no direction. Her feet carried her to a small park, a place where children played and older people exercised during the day, but at night held only darkness and the homeless. She sat on a stone bench, set her backpack by her feet, and looked up at a starless sky. The clock on her phone read 2 in the morning. The battery showed 15%. Grace felt as though she had lived an entire lifetime in just a few hours. She remembered nights like this when she was 16, after she ran away from her aunt's house because her aunt's boyfriend had tried to grope her in the kitchen. She had slept on the streets for 3 months, eaten from trash bins, bathed in public restrooms, until Tyler appeared like a savior with his gleaming car and charming smile. She had believed he was her escape, only to learn he was just another prison with invisible bars. And now she was here again, sitting on a park bench at 2 in the morning, with a 5-month belly and $23 in her wallet. Grace looked down at her stomach, felt the baby kick softly as if it were worried too, and she broke down. Tears streamed down her face, soaking into her old sweater, and she cried for all the years of suffering, for shattered dreams, for the child she had no idea how to protect. When the sobs finally eased, she wiped her eyes and looked at the black trash bag Mrs. Rodriguez had thrown her belongings into. She opened it to search for more clothes, and among the mess she saw black scraps of paper with silver lettering, the business card she had torn up. With trembling hands, Grace gathered the pieces, fitting them together like a puzzle, and found one fragment with the phone number intact. She stared at the number, then at her belly, then at the black night sky. She thought of the articles about missing people, about mysterious deaths, about a violent criminal world. Then she thought of her child, growing up on the streets, eating from trash bins, sleeping under bridges. The clock read 3 in the morning when Grace Mitchell dialed the number on the fragment of the card. The phone rang twice before someone answered. "Ms. Mitchell," Alessandro Rossi's voice came through, fully alert as if he hadn't slept at all. "I've been waiting for this call." Grace drew a deep breath, looked down at her belly one more time, then spoke with a voice that no longer trembled. "I'll take the job," she said, "but I have a condition." There was a second of silence on the other end. Then Alessandro replied, his voice holding not a trace of surprise. "I'm listening." The black car arrived to pick Grace up less than 20 minutes after the call, gliding through the streets of Miami like a ghost in the night. She sat in the back seat, clutching her backpack to her chest, watching the city slide past the window without truly seeing it. The driver didn't say a word, and Grace didn't ask where they were going, because she knew the answer wouldn't change her decision at this point. The car crossed the bridge, connecting the mainland to Star Island, the artificial island famous for housing Miami's richest and most powerful residents, and Grace felt as if she were crossing into an entirely different world. A wrought iron gate over 10 feet tall slowly opened as the car approached, security cameras tracking every movement, armed guards standing on either side like black statues in the dark. When the mansion came into view, Grace stopped breathing. It wasn't a house. It was a palace, with towering white stone columns, massive glass windows reflecting the moonlight, and a marble fountain set at the center of the circular drive. She had seen places like this in magazines and Hollywood movies, but she had never imagined she would ever set foot in one. The car stopped at the main entrance, and Alessandro Rossi stood there waiting for her, still wearing the same black suit as when she'd met him at the cafe, as if time itself meant nothing to this man. "Ms. Mitchell," he said as he opened the car door for her. "Welcome to my home." Grace stepped out, her feet touching the granite-paved walkway, and she felt like Cinderella entering a castle. Except the prince here was a mafia boss and she had no glass slippers, only worn sneakers with frayed heels. Alessandro led her inside, and if the exterior had overwhelmed her, the interior stole her breath entirely. The main hall soared upward with a Renaissance-style painted ceiling, twin marble staircases curving toward the upper floor, crystal chandeliers casting warm golden light onto polished oak floors. Grace looked around with wide eyes, knowing that the chandelier alone could probably pay her rent for the rest of her life. "You'll be living here," Alessandro said, as if reading her thoughts, "for security reasons. The work you'll be doing requires absolute confidentiality, and I can't guarantee that if you live elsewhere." Grace wanted to protest, wanted to say she had only agreed to work, not to move in, but she remembered the stone bench in the park and chose to stay silent. Alessandro gestured, and an older woman appeared from behind the staircase. She had silver hair neatly pinned back, a gentle face lined with the marks of a long life, and warm brown eyes that looked at Grace with a kindness she had never received from anyone before. "This is Maria," Alessandro said. "She's the housekeeper and will take care of everything you need." Maria stepped forward, took Grace's hand in her warm palms, and spoke with a thick Italian accent. "Poor child," she said. "So thin and pregnant too. Let me take care of you." "There are rules you need to remember," Alessandro said before turning away. "Don't ask about my work. Don't leave the house alone. And don't tell anyone what you see here. Follow those, and you'll be safe." Grace nodded, and Alessandro disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, as if he were part of it. Maria led Grace up to the second floor, through long corridors lined with paintings and sculptures. Grace didn't dare study too closely, afraid she might break something just by looking at it. The room Maria opened for her was larger than the studio apartment she had just been thrown out of, with a king-size bed dressed in white linens, windows overlooking Biscayne Bay, and a private bathroom with a bathtub as large as her former kitchen. Grace stood in the center of the room, unsure what to do, and when Maria closed the door to let her rest, she sat down on the bed and began to cry. Not from sadness, but because for the first time in many years, she felt safe, and the feeling was so unfamiliar that she didn't know how to hold it. The first week passed so quietly that Grace almost forgot she was living in the house of a mafia boss. Maria brought meals to her room 3 times a day, fragrant Italian dishes she had never tasted in her life, and Grace worked in a private study equipped with a new computer, high-speed internet, and everything she needed. The first documents she received were completely ordinary: business contracts between wine import companies, partnership agreements with upscale restaurants, and dry legal paperwork related to real estate. Grace translated from Italian into English, from Spanish into Portuguese, and she began to think that perhaps Alessandro Rossi really was just a normal businessman unfairly smeared by the press. Then the second week arrived, and everything changed. New files appeared on her computer screen, and from the very first glance, Grace knew something was wrong. Massive figures danced before her eyes. Millions of dollars moving through accounts in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Switzerland. Names were replaced with coded aliases like Grey Wolf, Night Shadow, and the Raven instead of real people. Suspicious locations such as an abandoned warehouse at the port of Miami and a fish processing plant in Key West appeared again and again. Grace wasn't foolish. She had a master's degree, and she'd read enough to recognize what she was looking at: money laundering. She was helping the Rossi family wash dirty money into clean money, turning dollars from drugs, gambling, and possibly other people's blood into legitimate investments in real estate and restaurants. Grace pushed her chair back from the screen, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought about standing up and walking out, about calling the police or the FBI or anyone who could get her out of this place. Then she looked down at her 5-month belly, felt the baby kick gently as if reminding her it existed, and she remembered the stone bench in the park, remembered the hollow hunger of nights when she was 16, remembered everything she had endured just to survive until now. "It's just documents," Grace whispered to herself in a weak attempt at justification. "I'm not hurting anyone. I'm only translating words from one language to another. Whatever they do with that information isn't my fault." She knew it was a lie, but she needed to believe it to keep going. She pulled her chair back to the screen and continued working, her fingers tapping the keys in a steady rhythm like the heartbeat of the child inside her. Every evening, Alessandro came to her office to check her progress. He never stayed long, only enough to review what she'd completed and give instructions for the next day. His face was always cold as stone, his voice flat and emotionless. But before leaving, he always asked the same question: "Have you eaten? Do you need anything else?" Grace always answered that she was fine, and Alessandro always nodded and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. She didn't understand why a Mafia boss would care whether she'd eaten or not. But she didn't ask, because the first rule he'd given her was not to ask about his work, and she assumed that rule also meant not asking about him. 2 weeks after moving into the mansion, Grace decided to leave her room and take a walk in the back garden. She had spent far too many hours in front of the computer screen. Her back had begun to ache, and the doctor Alessandro hired to examine her every week had advised gentle daily movement for the sake of the pregnancy. The garden stretched out like a private park, with neatly trimmed rows of trees, marble fountains, and rose beds bursting with color under the late afternoon sun. Grace followed the stone path, one hand supporting her lower back and the other resting on her belly, when she heard a child's laughter ring out from the other side of the rose bushes. She rounded the corner and froze at the sight before her. Alessandro Rossi, the cold and distant Mafia boss she had lived with for 2 weeks, was kneeling on the grass with a little boy of about 4 years old perched on his shoulders. The child had curly black hair and wide brown eyes, gripping Alessandro's hair and laughing uncontrollably as Alessandro pretended to be a horse, charging around the lawn. Alessandro's face was nothing like what Grace had seen before. The icy hardness was gone, the deep black eyes no longer empty. In its place was a bright smile and a gentleness so startling that Grace had to blink several times to be sure she was seeing the same man. "Faster, Zio Alex," the boy shouted in Italian, and Alessandro laughed out loud and ran faster, sending the child into delighted shrieks. Grace stood there, spellbound, unsure whether she should turn away or keep watching, when a woman's voice spoke beside her. "He's wonderful with children, isn't he?" Grace turned and saw a young woman, perhaps around 28, with long black hair and eyes the same color as Alessandro's. She wore a simple floral dress, and her smile was so warm that Grace felt at ease immediately. "I'm Sophia," the woman said as she held out her hand. "Alessandro's sister, and the little boy riding on my brother's shoulders is Gabriel, my son. He's the best godfather a child could ever have." Grace shook Sophia's hand, surprised by her friendliness compared to the guarded distance of everyone else in the house. "You're Grace, right?" Sophia said. "My brother mentioned you. Come, have tea with me. I think we should get to know each other since it looks like you'll be here for a while." They sat at a stone table beneath a flowering trellis, and Maria appeared as if by magic, with a tray of tea and pastries. Sophia asked Grace about her pregnancy, about how she was feeling living here, and she spoke with such genuine care that Grace slowly began to open up. When the conversation turned to Alessandro, Grace couldn't contain her curiosity and asked about the enigmatic man. Sophia fell silent for a moment, watching her brother play with Gabriel in the distance, then sighed. "He wasn't always like this," Sophia said quietly. "I mean the coldness you see, that isn't who he truly is." Our father was assassinated when Alessandro was only 20, right in front of him, and he had to take over the family before he even had time to grieve. Grace felt her heart tighten at the words. But that wasn't what froze his heart, Sophia continued, sadness creeping into her voice. He once loved someone. Her name was Isabella. They had been together since high school and planned to marry once he had stabilized the family. But our enemies kidnapped her and killed her to punish him. They sent her ashes in a box to our doorstep on his birthday. Grace lifted a hand to her mouth, unable to believe what she was hearing. From that day on, Sophia said, he closed his heart and swore never to let anyone get close again, because he was afraid they would be hurt because of him. He would rather live alone than watch someone he loves die because of him ever again. Sophia turned to Grace with a strange look in her eyes. But I've seen the way he looks at you, Sophia said. And it's something I haven't seen since Isabella died. Maybe you're more special than you think, Grace. Grace shook her head, her cheeks burning, though she didn't understand why. No, she said. I'm just his employee, nothing more. Sophia only smiled mysteriously and said nothing else. But Grace realized her heart was beating faster than usual, and she didn't dare look toward Alessandro, afraid she wouldn't be able to look away. 4 weeks passed like a dream Grace didn't want to wake from. Everything in the mansion slowly became familiar to her, from the sound of Maria's footsteps in the hallway each early morning to the rich aroma of Italian coffee drifting from the kitchen, from Gabriel's laughter echoing through the garden to the afternoon tea rituals with Sophia that had become routine. But the greatest change was Alessandro. Somewhere along the way, he began joining her for dinner, instead of eating alone in his study as he had before. At first the meals were silent, marked only by the soft clink of cutlery against porcelain, but gradually they began to talk. Alessandro asked about her work, about the challenges of translating specialized terminology, and Grace was surprised to discover that he truly listened rather than asking out of obligation. Then the conversations grew longer, drifting beyond work and into places Grace had tried to bury for many years. One night, after Maria had cleared the table and they remained with glasses of wine, Alessandro asked about the scar on her wrist. Grace didn't know why she answered instead of deflecting as she always had. Perhaps it was the flickering candlelight that made her feel safe. Perhaps it was the way his dark eyes held no judgment, only attention. Or perhaps she had carried these secrets for too long and they were suffocating her from the inside. She told him about Tyler, about 7 years of living in what she had called marriage but was truly hell. She spoke of nights he came home drunk and beat her because dinner was cold, of the times he forced himself on her when she said no, of the bruises she hid beneath long sleeves in the heat of summer. She told him about the night he kicked her in the stomach when he learned she was pregnant, screaming that he would never raise another man's child, even though the baby wasn't his but the result of a night she tried to forget her pain after the divorce. She told him about the scar on her wrist, about the darkest night of her life after the divorce, when she held a razor and thought dying would be easier than continuing to live, and how the only thing that stopped her was discovering she was pregnant 2 days later. Grace didn't cry as she spoke. Her voice was flat, as if she were reading someone else's story, but her hands trembled on the tabletop, and she couldn't bring herself to look into Alessandro's eyes, afraid she would see pity or disgust. Alessandro said nothing while she spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't question. He simply listened with complete focus. When she finished, the silence stretched so long that Grace thought she had made a mistake by saying too much. Then she felt a warm hand settle over hers, strong fingers gently closing around her trembling hand. "You're stronger than you think, Grace," Alessandro said, his voice low and softer than she had ever heard it. "You survived all of that, and you're still here, still fighting to give your child a better life. That isn't weakness. That's a strength most people don't have." Grace looked up at him, and for the first time she saw something different in those deep black eyes. Not coldness or indifference, but the understanding of someone who had endured a similar kind of pain. He didn't pull his hand away, and she didn't want him to. They sat like that in silence, hand in hand, and Grace realized with a mix of fear and fragile hope that she was developing feelings for this man, feelings she had sworn she would never allow herself to have for anyone again. But her heart didn't listen to reason, and the boundaries she had tried so hard to build between them were blurring with every heartbeat. Tyler Brooks wasn't a man who knew how to let go, and the obsession with the fact that Grace had slipped beyond his control had gnawed at him for weeks like a starving animal. He had hired a private investigator, spent thousands of dollars tracking her, and when he discovered that Grace was living in Alessandro Rossi's mansion on Star Island, a feverish jealousy ignited inside him and burned without mercy. That afternoon, Grace was walking through the back garden with Sophia as she often did. Her belly was noticeably larger after nearly 6 weeks living there, and the doctor said the baby was developing well. Sophia was telling her about plans for Gabriel's birthday when her phone rang, and she excused herself, stepping away to take the call. Grace stood alone near the rose bushes, breathing in the sweet scent of blooming flowers. When she heard footsteps behind her, she turned, thinking Sophia had returned, but the blood in her veins turned to ice when she saw the man standing there. Tyler Brooks, dressed in a black jacket and jeans, his blue eyes lit with the same madness she had seen far too many times during 7 years of marital hell. "You think you can run from me," Tyler said, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you can leave me and go live with that Italian criminal like a whore?" Grace stepped back, her heart hammering as her survival instinct screamed in her head to run, to run, to run. She opened her mouth to call for security, but Tyler lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers clamping down so hard she knew there would be bruises by morning. "You belong to me," Tyler snarled, his face inches from hers, the stench of alcohol heavy on his breath. "You'll always belong to me, and if I can't have you, no one will." "I'm not yours," Grace said, her voice shaking but steady with effort. "I never was. I was only your victim." The slap came so fast she couldn't react. Tyler's hand crashed against her cheek with enough force to send her reeling, nearly knocking her to the ground. Her head spun, her ears rang, and she tasted blood as her lip split against her teeth. Sophia screamed from somewhere in the distance, and Grace heard running footsteps approaching, but Tyler didn't care. He raised his hand again, ready to strike her a second time. The punch came from behind Tyler, powerful enough that Grace heard bone crack, and Tyler collapsed face first onto the grass like a sack of potatoes. Alessandro stood there, his black eyes no longer cold but blazing with pure fury, his face twisted in a rage Grace had never seen in any human being. Tyler tried to crawl up, blood pouring from his nose, one side of his face already swollen, but Alessandro didn't allow it. He grabbed Tyler by the collar, hauled him up, and drove a fist into his stomach, then his face, then his stomach again, each blow carrying the weight of 16 years of buried emotion and a pure hatred for men who hurt women. "Touch her again," Alessandro said through clenched teeth, "and I'll bury you alive. I won't just kill you. I'll make you beg to die before I allow you to." Marco and Luca appeared and dragged Tyler upright, his face now a mess of blood and bruises, and they hauled him away like a feral dog. Alessandro turned back to Grace, and the fury in his eyes vanished instantly when he saw her trembling, blood on her lip and a red mark blooming on her cheek. He rushed to her and caught her as her knees gave way, pulling her into his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Grace," he said, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't protect you well enough. This will never happen again, I swear." Grace couldn't speak. She clutched his jacket and cried, tears of fear and relief, and something else she didn't dare name, and Alessandro held her until she had no tears left to cry. That night Grace couldn't sleep, even though her body was utterly exhausted after everything that had happened. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and every time she closed her eyes, Tyler's deranged face reappeared like a ghost that refused to let her go. The bruise on her cheek had been iced and treated by Maria. The split on her lip had stopped bleeding, but the fear remained, hiding in every corner of her mind like a beast waiting for the chance to strike. The clock read 2 a.m. when Grace finally gave up on sleep and decided to walk through the house to chase away the dark thoughts. She slipped on the silk robe Maria had laid out for her and stepped into the silent hallway, her bare feet cool against the oak floor. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting silver streaks across the ground, and Grace followed that light as if it were leading her somewhere. She stopped in front of the double doors of the library, a room she had never entered before because it lay in Alessandro's private wing. The door was slightly open, warm golden light spilling out, mixed with the scent of whiskey and old books. Grace hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door and stepped inside. The library was vast, with shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, thousands of books arranged neatly by language and subject. A fire burned low in the hearth, and Alessandro sat in a leather armchair before it, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze fixed on the flames as if searching for answers there. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms traced with prominent veins, his black hair slightly disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it again and again. "You can't sleep either," Alessandro said without turning around, as though he'd known she was there all along. Grace walked in, took the chair opposite him, and shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him," she admitted, "and I hate myself for still being afraid of him after everything." Alessandro turned to her, the firelight dancing in his deep black eyes. "Fear isn't weakness," he said. "It's survival instinct. It's what kept you alive until now. Don't hate yourself for it." They sat in silence for a while, The only sounds the crackle of fire and the night wind outside the windows. Then Grace asked the question she'd been holding back for a long time. "Why did you help me that day at the cafe?" she asked. "Why did you care about a woman you didn't even know?" Alessandro didn't answer right away. He took a sip of whiskey and stared into the flames, as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher and lower than usual. "Because you looked like you'd given up," he said, his eyes still on the fire. "I recognized that look because I saw it in the mirror every day for years, after Isabella died." Grace felt her heart tighten at the name. The name Sophia had told her about. "You still love her," Grace said. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Alessandro finally turned to her, and in his dark eyes she saw a depth of pain time couldn't heal. "I'll always love her," he said. "But she's gone and I'm still here. For 16 years I lived like a hollow shell, because I believed that if I felt nothing, I couldn't be hurt again." He set the glass aside and leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. "Then you appeared," he said, his voice softening, with a cold cup of coffee and the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. "And for the first time in 16 years, I wanted to feel something. I wanted to protect someone. I wanted to live instead of just existing." Grace didn't know when she started crying, but tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Alessandro stood and moved toward her, kneeling in front of her as if she were a queen rather than a pregnant woman running from her past. He lifted his hand and wiped the tears from her face, his rough fingers gentle as butterfly wings against her skin. "I know I don't deserve you," he said. "I'm a criminal. My hands are stained with blood. My world is full of danger. But you're the only woman who's ever made me want to be better, who's made me want to wake up every morning with a reason to live." Grace looked into his eyes and saw everything he couldn't say. The loneliness, the pain, and a deep feeling struggling to ignite after years of being frozen. She knew she should stand up and walk away. Knew that loving a mafia boss was the most reckless thing she could do. But her heart didn't listen to reason. She leaned forward, and Alessandro met her halfway, his lips touching hers in their first kiss. The kiss began softly, hesitantly, like two people testing unfamiliar ground, then deepened, grew more intense, and Grace felt as though she were melting in his arms. They kissed until they were breathless, and when their lips parted, Grace realized she was trembling, not with fear but with overwhelming emotion. Then reason returned like a splash of cold water, and she stood up, stepping back, a hand covering her mouth. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "You're Mafia, and I'm pregnant with another man's child, and everything is too crazy." Grace fled the library, leaving Alessandro standing alone with the taste of her kiss still on his lips and her words echoing in his mind. But he didn't follow her, because he knew she needed time, and if he'd waited 16 years to feel something again, he could wait a little longer. Tyler Brooks lay in a hospital bed with a broken nose and cracked ribs, but the damage to his body was nothing compared to the wound to his pride. He had been defeated by Alessandro Rossi, humiliated in front of Grace, and thrown out of the mansion like a stray dog. Rage churned inside him like volcanic lava, and Tyler knew he couldn't confront the mafia boss head-on with his own strength. He needed allies, and in Miami's underworld, the enemy of your enemy was your friend. The Carbone family had been at war with the Rossi family for decades, and when Tyler reached out through an acquaintance in the shadowy real estate brokerage scene, they were more than willing to listen. In exchange for information about the Star Island Mansion's security system that Tyler had carefully observed while hiring a private investigator to track Grace, the Carbone family agreed to help him reclaim his ex-wife and strike at Alessandro Rossi's territory at the same time. It was a perfect arrangement for both sides, except for Grace, who would become a pawn on the board of men driven mad by power and possession. 3 days after the kiss in the library, Grace was still avoiding Alessandro whenever she could. She didn't know how to face him, didn't know how to explain the chaos inside her heart, so she chose to hide in her room and only venture out when absolutely necessary. That night, she was sitting by the window reading when the first gunshot rang out, shattering the mansion's calm like thunder under a clear sky. Grace jumped to her feet, the book falling to the floor, and she looked out the window to see dark figures climbing over the walls, muzzle flashes flickering in the darkness like hellish fireflies. Screams erupted everywhere, footsteps thundered through the halls, glass shattered, and gunfire echoed without pause. Grace backed away from the window, her heart racing as she wrapped her arms around her 7-month belly as if her own body could shield her child. Her door burst open, and Marco rushed in, his face tight with urgency, a gun in his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, follow me now," he said. "We're taking you to the safe room." Grace didn't have time to ask what was happening. She ran after Marco into hallways thick with smoke and noise. They were halfway down when a shot rang out from behind them and Marco collapsed with a groan, blood pouring from his shoulder and staining the wooden floor. Grace screamed and turned back to help him, but a familiar hand grabbed her hair and yanked her backward. "Miss me, sweetheart," Tyler whispered in her ear, and Grace felt the blood in her veins turn to stone. Tyler stood there with a still smoking gun in his hand, his face still bruised from Alessandro's beating, but his eyes burned with triumphant madness. "I told you," Tyler said as he dragged her toward the service staircase. "You belong to me, and no one gets to take you from me." Grace struggled and tried to scream, but Tyler pressed the gun to her belly and she froze. "Make one sound," Tyler snarled, "and I'll shoot straight through that damn stomach." Grace didn't dare move again. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she let Tyler drag her down the stairs, through the back door, and into a black car waiting outside. As the car sped into the night, Grace looked through the rear window and saw the mansion swallowed by smoke and fire, gunshots still echoing, and she didn't know whether Alessandro was still alive. She called his name in her mind, a silent prayer sent to the man she had finally realized she loved, but only darkness and fear answered her. Tyler sat beside her, one hand still gripping the gun, the other clamped around her wrist so tightly she thought the bone would snap. "Now we can start over," Tyler said with a twisted smile, "and this time you'll learn to obey me, even if I have to teach you the painful way." When the final gunshots faded and the smoke of gunpowder slowly thinned in the air, Alessandro stood in the main hall of the mansion, with his enemy's blood splattered across his white shirt and unspent fury still burning in his dark eyes. The Carbone family had paid dearly for their recklessness. Their attackers lay scattered across the floor, and those still alive had fled like rats. But victory meant nothing the moment Alessandro realized Grace was gone. Marco lay on the floor with a gunshot wound to his shoulder, his face drained of color from blood loss. Yet he forced himself to speak when he saw his boss. "Tyler Brooks," Marco whispered. He took her. "I'm sorry, boss. I couldn't stop him." Alessandro didn't wait for him to finish. He turned to Luca with a look that made even the most cold-blooded killers tremble. "Find out who betrayed us," he said, his voice ice-cold and lethal, "and find where she is." Within an hour, Luca dragged the traitorous guard before Alessandro. The man had been hired only 2 months earlier and had sold details of the security system to the Carbone family in exchange for $50,000. Alessandro didn't say a word. He simply nodded, and 2 men hauled the traitor into a basement room whose existence was known only to the Rossi family. What happened in that room over the next 30 minutes was something even Alessandro's most loyal men would never speak of. When Alessandro emerged, his hands were soaked in blood, and he had an address for an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of southern Miami. Tyler had taken Grace there, a place the Carbone family used to torture and execute their enemies. Inside that warehouse, Grace was living a nightmare she had believed she escaped long ago. Tyler had tied her to a wooden chair, her hands cuffed behind her back and a rag stuffed into her mouth to silence her screams. He paced around her like a wolf savoring its prey's terror, talking non-stop, every venomous word stabbing her like a blade. "You really think that Italian bastard will want you when he knows who you are?" Tyler laughed loudly. An orphan with no parents, beaten by her own aunt and molested by her aunt's lover. "You think I didn't know? You think I married you for love?" He leaned in close, his alcohol-soaked breath washing over her face. "I married you because you were easy to control," Tyler said, "because you had no one in this world, and you'd endure anything as long as someone gave you a roof over your head. And I was right for 7 years, wasn't I?" Grace cried silently, tears soaking the rag in her mouth, praying someone would come for her, praying Alessandro was still alive and would find her. Tyler straightened and looked at her 7-month belly with disgust. "I hate that belly," Tyler said. "I hate that you're carrying another man's child, and maybe I should help you take care of that problem." The first kick came so suddenly Grace couldn't react. Tyler's boot slammed into her belly, and pain exploded like a bomb. Grace screamed through the gag, her body convulsing as she felt something wet between her legs. But Tyler didn't stop. He kicked her again, once, twice, and the world began to spin. Gunfire thundered. The warehouse doors burst open, and Alessandro stepped inside like death incarnate. His dark eyes burned with a fury that made even hell tremble. And he didn't speak. He simply raised his gun and fired. The bullet tore through Tyler's shoulder, blood spraying as he collapsed onto the concrete floor, screaming in agony. "Death would be too easy for you," Alessandro said as he stepped past Tyler's writhing body and rushed to Grace, his hands shaking as he freed her. Grace collapsed against his chest, blood soaking her dress, her body trembling uncontrollably as the pain in her abdomen grew so severe she couldn't breathe. Alessandro lifted her into his arms as if she were a child, and for the first time in 16 years his voice shook when he spoke. "Stay with me, Grace," he said, his eyes wet though he didn't realize it. "Please don't leave me. Do you hear me? That's an order." But Grace heard nothing anymore. She slipped into unconsciousness in his arms, and the blood continued to flow like a dark red river across the cold concrete floor. The car tore through the streets of Miami at a reckless speed. Alessandro in the back seat with Grace unconscious in his arms, her blood soaking into his shirt and trousers, and he didn't care. Not about the blood, not about anything except holding her close and praying she wouldn't leave him. They didn't go to a public hospital. Alessandro had a private hospital owned by the family, a place where doctors were paid well to ask no questions and keep secrets until death. Dr. James Chen was waiting when the car arrived, and his face went pale at the sight of how much blood Grace had lost. "Placental abruption," Dr. Chen said as they rushed Grace into the operating room. "She's bleeding internally, and it's severe. We have to operate immediately to save both mother and child, but I can't promise you anything." Alessandro grabbed the doctor by the collar and dragged him close, his dark eyes blazing with a desperation the doctor had never seen in the usually ice-cold Mafia boss. "Save her," Alessandro roared. "Save them both. I'll give you anything you want, but if they die, you'll die with them." Dr. Chen didn't fear the threat. He'd worked for the Rossi family too long to fear anything. He only nodded and disappeared behind the operating room doors, leaving Alessandro alone in the sterile corridor with Grace's blood on his hands and suffocating fear crushing his chest. The hours that followed were the longest of Alessandro Rossi's life. He stood outside the operating room, didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't sit, only stared at the illuminated sign, showing surgery in progress. Sophia came and tried to pull him away to rest, but he didn't move. Maria came and tried to hand him a glass of water, but he didn't even look. He was stone, alive only in his eyes, and they were dying a little more with every passing minute. 6 hours later, the operating room doors opened, and Dr. Chen stepped out, his face drained with exhaustion but a tired smile on his lips. "The boy survived," he said. "Born prematurely in the 7th month, weighing 1 kilogram, 200 grams. We've placed him in an incubator, and he's fighting." Alessandro felt his knees give way but forced himself to stay upright. "And Grace?" he asked, his voice hoarse after 6 hours of silence. Dr. Chen hesitated, and that hesitation stabbed Alessandro's heart like a blade. "She's alive," the doctor finally said, "but she lost too much blood and her body endured massive trauma. She's in a coma, and we don't know when she'll wake up, or if she ever will." Alessandro walked into Grace's room like a sleepwalker, and when he saw her lying there on the white hospital bed, tubes running into her body and machines beeping steadily with her heartbeat, he felt as if someone were crushing his heart in their fist. She looked so small, so fragile, that he was afraid she'd shatter if he touched her. Alessandro pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down, taking her hand in his, her skin cold and pale against his palm. He didn't know how long he sat there. Maybe hours, maybe a whole day. He didn't care. For the first time in 16 years, Alessandro Rossi bowed his head and prayed. He wasn't a religious man. He'd committed too many sins to believe God would listen to him. But he prayed anyway, prayed for Grace to wake up, prayed for the tiny boy in the incubator to survive, and he promised whoever might be listening that he would change, that he would become a better man, if they would just give him the chance to stay with them. 3 days passed like 3 centuries for Alessandro Rossi. He didn't leave Grace's hospital room except to check on Ethan in the neonatal intensive care unit, the tiny boy he had named without asking anyone because he wanted the child to have a name to fight with. Sophia brought him food, but he barely touched it. Maria begged him to rest, but he refused, and stubble crept along his jaw because he didn't bother to shave. He only sat there, holding Grace's hand, and waited. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the first sunlight slipped through the curtains and fell across Grace's pale face, her fingers stirred faintly in his grasp. Alessandro straightened, his heart pounding with a hope he hardly dared believe. Then her eyelids fluttered, and the green eyes he had missed for 3 endless days slowly opened. "Grace," Alessandro whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Can you hear me?" Grace blinked several times as if trying to understand where she was. Then her eyes focused on Alessandro's face, on the unshaven beard, the bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep, and a weariness she had never seen on the cold Mafia boss. "The baby," Grace murmured, her voice weak and dry. "My son, is he all right?" Alessandro tightened his grip on her hand, and for the first time in 3 days, a smile touched his lips. "Ethan," he said. "I named him Ethan, and he's fighting just like his mother. The doctors say he's improving every day." Tears welled at the corners of Grace's eyes and spilled onto the white pillow, and she didn't know whether she was crying from relief or happiness or everything she had endured. An hour later, when Grace was alert enough and Dr. Chen had checked her vitals, Alessandro wheeled her to the neonatal intensive care unit to meet her son. Ethan lay inside the incubator, so small it stole Grace's breath. Tiny fingers, reddened, fragile skin, wires and tubes attached to his little body to keep him alive. Grace reached out and touched the incubator, and as if sensing his mother, Ethan shifted and his tiny fingers curled as if searching for something. "My baby," Grace whispered through tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Alessandro stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his voice low and steady in her ear. "He'll be all right," he said. "I've hired the best doctors, bought the best equipment. He'll grow up healthy and strong like his mother." Grace turned to look at him, and she realized this man had stayed by her side for 3 days, had named her child, had cared for her son as if he were his own. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing all this?" Alessandro met her gaze for a long moment, then slowly dropped to one knee in front of her, right there in the neonatal unit, in front of nurses and doctors, not caring who was watching. "I know I don't deserve you," Alessandro said, his sincerity tightening Grace's chest. "I'm a criminal. I've killed people. I've done things you should never have to know. But I love you, Grace. I've loved you since the day I saw you in that cafe, with a cold cup of coffee and the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. And I love Ethan as my own son, as if he carried my blood." He took both her hands, his rough fingers warm against her skin. "Give me a chance," he said. "Give me a chance to prove I'm worthy of you. Give me a lifetime to protect you and Ethan. I promise I won't ever let anyone hurt either of you again." Grace looked down at the man kneeling before her, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast bowing to her like a knight before his queen, and she couldn't speak, only nod as tears continued to fall. Tyler Brooks didn't die, even though Alessandro wanted him dead more than anything else in the world. The bullet through his shoulder wasn't enough to finish the bastard, and Alessandro had to restrain his fury and hand Tyler over to the police instead of burying him alive as he had promised. But Alessandro Rossi knew how to play the long game, and he understood that death would have been a release for Tyler, while 20 years in federal prison among real criminals would be a prolonged hell he truly deserved. The evidence against Tyler piled up like a mountain: kidnapping, aggravated assault, intentional harm to a pregnant woman, and on top of that, financial fraud and tax evasion uncovered by Alessandro's team during their investigation. The trial took place 2 months after Grace was discharged from the hospital, while Ethan was still there but far stronger, with doctors promising he would be able to go home within a few weeks. Grace stood in court with Alessandro at her side, and for the first time in her life, she faced Tyler without fear. He sat at the defendant's table in an orange prison uniform, thinner now, hollowed out by weeks in jail, and when his blue eyes met hers, Grace no longer saw the demon who had haunted her for 7 years. She saw only a pitiful man who was afraid, and that fear gave her a strength she never knew she had. When she was called to the witness stand, Grace told everything. She spoke of 7 years of marital hell, of beatings and humiliation, of nights spent crying alone and wondering if she somehow deserved it. She told them about the night Tyler kicked her stomach when he learned she was pregnant, about the scar on her wrist she had given herself when she believed dying would be easier than living. She told them about the night he kidnapped her and nearly killed her and her unborn child. Her voice didn't shake, her eyes never left the jury, and when she finished, the courtroom was utterly silent. "He doesn't get to take anything from me anymore," Grace said, her voice echoing through the room. "I lost 7 years of my life to him. I almost lost my life and my son. But I'm still here. I'm still standing. And I've found myself again." The jury needed only 2 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts, and the judge sentenced Tyler Brooks to 20 years in federal prison without parole. As the guards led Tyler away, he turned back and screamed at Grace, threats and curses ricocheting through the courtroom. "I'll find you," Tyler shouted. "I'll get out and I'll kill you. You hear me? You belong to me." But Grace didn't turn around. She simply tightened her grip on Alessandro's hand and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. Outside the courthouse, beneath the blazing Miami sun, Alessandro pulled her into his arms and kissed her forehead. "You were brave," he said. "I'm proud of you." Grace looked up at him, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt light, as if a crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The past was over, and the future was waiting. 3 months in the hospital felt like the longest stretch of Grace's life. Yet they were also the months in which she witnessed a miracle unfold day by day. Ethan grew from a tiny, fragile being barely over a kilogram into a healthy 3.5-kilo baby with his mother's green eyes and a head of glossy black hair no one could quite trace back to either side. The day doctor. Chen announced that Ethan was strong enough to go home. Grace cried like a child, and Alessandro stood beside her with a smile. Sophia later said she hadn't seen on her brother's face since he himself had been a boy. The Star Island mansion had been fully repaired after the attack, and Alessandro had turned the room next to the master bedroom into the most perfect nursery Grace had ever seen. The walls were painted a soft blue, hand-painted white clouds drifting across them. A solid oak crib, carved by hand in Italy, stood at the center of the room, surrounded by more toys than Ethan could possibly play with in the next 10 years. Grace carried her son into that room and felt, for the first time, that her life finally made sense. The weeks that followed were a blur of sweet chaos that came with caring for a newborn, and what surprised Grace the most was Alessandro's complete involvement. The most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast learned how to change diapers with endearing clumsiness, fingers that once held guns now fumbling with the tiny snaps on Ethan's pajamas. He learned how to mix formula to the exact right temperature, testing it on his wrist just as Maria had shown him. And when he overheated the bottle the first time, he spent hours blaming himself. He woke up every night at Ethan's first cry, even when Grace told him to sleep so he could work the next morning. But he refused, insisting that this was his responsibility and that he didn't want to miss a single moment. One night, Grace woke at 3 a.m. and realized Alessandro wasn't beside her. She walked to the nursery and stopped in the doorway, her heart melting at the sight before her. Alessandro sat in the rocking chair by the window, Ethan cradled against his chest, softly singing a lullaby in Italian. Later, Sophia told her it was the same song their mother had sung to Alessandro when he was small. His voice was low and imperfect, but Ethan slept peacefully in his arms as if he were in the safest place on earth. Grace stood there and cried silently. Not from sadness, but from the sheer disbelief at how completely her life had changed. 6 months later, when Ethan was 9 months old, all gummy smiles and delighted laughter whenever he saw Alessandro. Alessandro took Grace to the beach, where he owned a private vacation home. They walked along the shoreline at sunset, Ethan asleep in his stroller, the waves brushing softly against the sand like a lullaby of their own. Then Alessandro stopped, turned to Grace, and slowly knelt down in the sand. Grace covered her mouth when she saw the black velvet box in his hand, and when he opened it, the diamond ring inside caught the light of the setting sun like a fallen star. "This ring belonged to my mother," Alessandro said, his voice trembling with an emotion he wasn't used to showing. "She told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Grace Mitchell," he continued. "You gave me a reason to live. You gave me a family. You gave me a love I never believed I deserved. Give me a lifetime to prove I deserve you. Be my wife." Grace looked down at the man kneeling before her, the feared Mafia boss with deep black eyes now filled with hope and nervous vulnerability like a young boy's, and she didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, I will." Alessandro stood and kissed her beneath the burning sky, the waves rolling in around their feet, while Ethan stirred in his stroller as if he wanted to be part of the moment too. The wedding was held at the Rossi family's seaside estate, the very place where Alessandro had proposed to Grace 3 months earlier, and everything felt so perfect that Grace thought she must be living inside a dream. White roses and orchids were arranged everywhere, from the entrance gate to the reception tables, from the shoreline to the ceremonial arch built directly on the sand. The guests were only those closest to them, Sophia and Gabriel, Maria, and the most loyal members of the Rossi family. And even though Grace had no blood relatives to invite, she didn't feel the absence because she had found her family here. Grace stood before the mirror in the dressing room, looking at the woman reflected back at her wearing a simple yet elegant white wedding gown, and she could barely recognize herself. 1 year ago, she had been a pregnant woman sitting in a cafe with a cold cup of coffee and $23 in her wallet, and now she was about to become Alessandro Rossi's wife. Sophia stepped in, adjusted Grace's veil, then hugged her with tears in her eyes, and told her she looked beautiful, and that her brother was the luckiest man alive. When it was time for the ceremony, Grace walked out of the room and realized she had no one to escort her down the aisle. She was used to standing alone, had accepted that she would walk toward Alessandro by herself, just as she had walked through every hardship in her life. Then Marco appeared, the loyal guard who had been shot while trying to protect her the night Tyler attacked. His shoulder still aching, but his posture straight in a black suit as he offered her his arm. "Allow me to represent the Rossi family and walk you to the man you love," he said, and Grace had to bite her lip to keep from crying and ruining her makeup. She took Marco's arm and stepped outside into a sky painted orange and pink by the setting sun, and Alessandro stood waiting for her at the end of the aisle in a black suit, looking at her in a way she knew she would never forget. He looked at her as if she were his entire world, as if no one else existed, and when she reached him, he took her hand and whispered that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The ceremony was simple and solemn. They exchanged vows beneath white flowers with the sound of the waves as their music, and when the priest declared them husband and wife, Alessandro kissed her with all the love he had kept buried for 16 years. The reception began as the sun disappeared into the sea, lanterns glowing throughout the garden, and soft jazz drifting from the live band. Grace was holding Ethan and talking with Sophia when the first gunshot rang out, tearing through the calm evening like thunder from a clear sky. The Carbone family had waited for this moment for months, waiting for a day when Alessandro would let his guard down, and the wedding was the perfect chance to take revenge for their defeat at the Star Island mansion. The attackers poured in from every direction, gunfire erupting non-stop as guests screamed and scattered. Alessandro rushed to Grace instantly, pushing her and Ethan beneath a table and shielding them with his body. "Stay here," he said, his voice cold and focused like the Mafia boss he was rather than a groom on the happiest day of his life. "I'll be back." Then he pulled a gun from somewhere inside his suit and charged into the fight. Grace clutched Ethan to her chest, the baby screaming in terror, as she tried to keep them both quiet beneath the white tablecloth that was slowly being stained red with someone's blood. Gunshots echoed everywhere, screams and shattering glass blending into a symphony of hell. Then Grace saw Alessandro exchanging fire with 2 Carbone men when a third appeared behind him and shot. The bullet tore through Alessandro's shoulder and he fell, blood soaking his white shirt, yet he kept firing even from the ground. Grace screamed when she saw him wounded, and that scream drew another attacker's attention to her hiding place. The man advanced toward the table with a gun and wild eyes, and Grace knew he wouldn't stop until she and Ethan were dead. Beside her, one of Alessandro's guards lay motionless, his gun just inches from his hand. Grace didn't think. A mother's instinct was stronger than any fear. She set Ethan down and grabbed the gun. She had never held a weapon before, had never believed she could harm anyone. But when she saw a man moving toward her son with the intent to kill, she didn't hesitate. The gun exploded in her hands, the recoil nearly knocking her backward, but the bullet found its mark. The man collapsed with a hole in his chest, and Grace stared at his body with shaking hands, realizing she had killed someone for the first time in her life. Alessandro saw her from where he lay, and in his dark eyes filled with pain there was both pride and heartbreak that she had been forced to do it. The fight ended when Alessandro shot the leader of the attackers, and the rest fled into the night like rats. Grace ran to Alessandro, her white wedding dress soaked in blood, holding him as she screamed for a doctor. "I'm fine," Alessandro said, his voice weak but smiling at her anyway. "It's just my shoulder. I've survived worse than this." "I shot him," Grace said, her voice trembling, still unable to believe what she had done. "I killed someone." "You protected our child," Alessandro said, lifting a hand to touch her cheek. "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen, and I've never loved you more than I do right now." 1 year had passed since that blood-soaked wedding, and Grace Mitchell, now Grace Rossi, was living a life she'd never dared to imagine. The wound on Alessandro's shoulder had healed, leaving behind a scar he said was a reminder of the night he'd nearly lost everything that mattered most. The Carbone family had been completely wiped out after their failed attack, and Alessandro had used that moment to consolidate his power, but at the same time he'd begun shifting the family's operations toward legitimate businesses just as he'd promised Grace. Ethan was now 2 years old, a lively little boy with black hair and his mother's green eyes, and the sound of him calling Daddy every time Alessandro came home was, as the Mafia boss often said, something he wouldn't trade for anything in the world. And inside Grace, a new life was growing, 3 months along, and already making her nauseous every morning. That afternoon, as Grace pushed Ethan's stroller through the park near their home, her phone lit up with a news alert. Tyler Brooks had been released early after 2 years due to prison overcrowding, and he was somewhere in the city of Miami. Grace stopped to read the message, surprised to realize she felt nothing at all. No racing heart, no trembling hands, no panic like she'd once imagined would happen if Tyler ever walked free. She felt only indifference, as if she were reading about a complete stranger. She continued pushing Ethan along the park path, and that was when she saw him. Tyler Brooks stood at a bus stop across the street, far thinner than the last time she'd seen him in the courtroom, his face hollow and his blue eyes, once full of confidence, now dull and exhausted. 2 years in prison had stripped away every trace of polish, leaving behind a man who looked like a ghost of himself. Tyler saw her at the same moment she saw him, and he froze, his mouth opening as if he wanted to say something. Grace didn't stop, didn't look away, didn't feel afraid. She kept pushing Ethan's stroller past him with her head held high and her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if Tyler Brooks were nothing more than a tree by the roadside that didn't deserve her attention. She felt his eyes on her, felt him hesitate as if he might follow. But then he stopped. Maybe because he noticed the 2 guards in black suits walking a short distance behind her. Maybe because he remembered what had happened the last time he tried to touch her. Whatever the reason, Tyler Brooks let her go, and Grace didn't look back even once. That evening, after Ethan was asleep in the nursery and the house had fallen quiet, Grace and Alessandro sat on the balcony, overlooking Biscayne Bay, the lights of Miami shimmering across the water like a scattered galaxy. Alessandro rested his hand on her belly, where their second child was growing, and said with hopeful certainty that this time it would be a girl, that he could feel it. Grace laughed and told him he'd said the same thing about Ethan, but she didn't mind if he was wrong again because she'd love the baby no matter what. They sat in silence for a while, Grace looking down at the bustling city below, where millions of people were living their own lives with their own joys and sorrows. She thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half earlier, the woman sitting in a cafe with a cold cup of coffee and $23 in her wallet, the woman who believed her life was over when it was only just beginning. Tyler used to say I was nothing without him, Grace said to Alessandro, her voice calm, as if she were talking about a movie she'd watched long ago. And for years I believed that. I believed I was worthless, that I deserved to be treated badly, that I didn't deserve love. Alessandro squeezed her hand tighter but didn't interrupt, just listening as he always did. But he was wrong, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. I am everything. I am Alessandro Rossi's wife. I am Ethan's mother. I am a survivor. I walked through hell and I'm still here, still breathing, still loving, still hoping. And no one, not Tyler, not the past, not fear, can ever take that away from me again. Alessandro kissed her forehead and whispered that he loved her, and Grace rested her head against his shoulder, gazing out at the dark sea and the stars above, knowing she'd finally found where she belonged. The story of Grace Mitchell is proof of the extraordinary strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. From the depths of despair, she rose to find love, family, and peace she truly deserved. The lesson this story offers all of us is never let your past define your future. Never let someone else's cruel words become the truth about who you are, and never give up hope no matter how deeply life tries to push you down. Every one of us deserves to be loved, to be respected, and to live a meaningful life. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to the greatest happiness. Thank you for following today's story from beginning to end. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with anyone you think needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our daily emotional stories. We'd truly love to know how you felt about Grace and Alessandro's journey. Have you ever faced moments in life that felt impossible to overcome? Do you believe in second chances and the power of genuine love? Please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We're always listening for voices that speak from the heart. We wish everyone watching good health, a peaceful life, and joy in each new day. Remember, you deserve happiness, and it's never too late to begin again. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.